Hello, welcome to the Deep 404. Um, as you may have noticed, my background is different. I'm currently travelling away from home on holiday with my family, with some friends, but thought it was time to put together a bit of a report on what's been going on in both Israel and Ukraine. One article that I saw today that I'd just like to talk about to do with the Al-Ahli Arab hospital explosion earlier in the week. Not to go into who conducted that attack. There's a lot of information out there. If you take the time to have a look at that, there's a lot of good information that you can find that seems to indicate a particular type of weapon was used, perhaps one that was launched from an aircraft. Anyhow, interestingly, some of the conversation has been around the fact of why it wasn't a high explosive attack on the building structure itself. An article I saw today talking about the Al-Shifa Hospital, which is the largest hospital in Gaza, saying that they've opened a section in the hospital courtyard because it cannot accommodate the number of wounded that it's trying to deal with. This, I feel, may explain why numbers of reported killed and wounded in the al-Ahli hospital explosion were high, even though it appears as though it may have been an airburst munition over the car park area. It seems that it's quite possible that there may be many people around and outside the hospital, whether they were some people being housed out there because of a lack of space inside the hospital. But this sort of thing in this type of conflict, where you are running out of water and electricity, would force things like that to happen with a large number of people being injured. It's not inconceivable that effectively field hospitals may have been set up outside, and that may have led to why there were large numbers of reported casualties without the actual building of the hospital itself having been struck. And the building itself of the hospital was not destroyed in the fashion that we've seen apartment blocks in Gaza being destroyed. So just an interesting thought there, perhaps, that explains some of the questions around that particular topic. On the topic of the Israeli assault on Gaza, Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, a spokesman for the Israeli military, has said that, has been reported as saying, the emphasis is on damage and not on accuracy. And this was accompanied by another unnamed Israeli official who was telling media in Gaza that the city would be reduced to a city of tents by the end of the campaign. Interesting that these public comments coming from someone within the Israeli military. It appears as though they're not in effect trying to hide the fact that the bombing of Gaza is indiscriminate. If you saw, I think it was my last episode, I started with that 2-minute video there where it was just showing the high explosive bomb strikes on Gaza and the devastating effect it was having, where single or perhaps paired strikes were just dropping an entire multi-story apartment block. So, yep, some confirmation from the Israelis themselves that that is the approach that is being taken here. This is obviously leading to a large outcry, and what appears to be in other Arab nations, unification of factions. In Iraq, we have now the Islamic Resistance in Iraq, which appears to be a unification of pro-Iranian factions, Shiite militias in Iraq, ones who are loyal to Iran and have begun to unite, publishing joint statements under the name of the Islamic Resistance in Iraq. There's reports by the Mayadeen TV channel that the Islamic Resistance of Iraq has been involved or claimed responsibility for attack on a US base in Iraqi Kurdistan. 2 unmanned aerial vehicles were involved in this attack. The American base, it's located at the Harir military airfield near Erbil, which is about 420 k's away from Baghdad. In Beirut, and in Jordan and in Syria. There are protests today, videos from early today, last night from where I'm seeing things in Beirut. Reportedly 100,000 protesters. I can't corroborate if that is the actual number, but a large number of protesters there in Beirut. So definitely seeing support in the Arab world growing for Gaza over the Israeli response in the area. Now, as I mentioned, the last report, it seems as though the Israelis have gotten cold feet about a ground offensive going into Gaza. Now, there are reports coming out today that President Biden, American President Biden, has said to Israel that he wants them to wait. He doesn't want them to go in and initiate their ground attack yet, because he wants more time to negotiate for the release of American hostages. So this on the surface, this may be part of the reasoning, but I think a larger part of this is when you consider Israel has a large force. They have 300,000 or more reservists, but in Israel, 40% of their reservists are women, not men. A lot of their reservists are young and unexperienced, other than their military training. Israel's army is a reserve army. It's not a standing army. So a lot of these people, while yes, they're returning and they are reservists and they have had military training, their actual skill level in combat is yet to really be seen and tested once they enter the streets of Gaza. Now, once Israel sends its ground forces into Gaza, they run the risk there of very, very bad domestic pressure after the expected large numbers of casualties to the defense forces begin to rise. Remember that within Gaza, the Hamas fighters have had years in there to develop networks of tunnels, pathways through the area, which they'll know better than anyone else. This is going to be difficult with all the damage that's been caused in these areas to move tanks around. Even if they do move tanks around, Hamas have anti-tank weapons, and it's very easy to, as I've said, from a second or third floor building, look down upon a tank and attack it from the top, which is usually the weakest place to attack a tank. Plus, if the Israelis find themselves in a grinding urban battle from door to door, from building to building, they will suffer heavy casualties. Now, of course, the Hamas fighters will as well, but it seems as though the Israelis will be lacking the high explosive artillery they might like to take with them to try to soften up locations before they send in their ground forces. So definitely some reasons. Also politically, the Israelis just want to be careful that whatever approach they see here doesn't not only shift the opinion in the Arab world, which is already obviously happening, but doesn't shift it too much in the Western world. Right now, they have the backing of President Biden. He's committed full support. We're seeing that there is an aid package that Biden is asking for, which is a $74 billion aid package. Of that, $14 billion is looking at going towards Israel. The other $60 billion is for Ukraine. So interesting. Continued commitment by Biden to fight the war in Ukraine. As expected, the funding package is being combined with an Israeli funding package. We announced this a week or so ago, that after the original funding package that was looked to go through was stopped in the House, it was rejected. We talked about the fact that we'd expect to see now a combined one, and that's what's happened with Israel. So effectively, the Ukrainian funding will come through on the coattails of the Israeli funding, feeling being that no one in America right now will say no to funding some support for Israel, and if that's tied with the Ukrainian funding, then the Ukrainians get their funding as well. There is, however, growing resolve against the West. The Iranian and Saudi ministers met in Jeddah again this week. So this is very significant in its own right. It's only been recently that there has been a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. The the normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi. The Saudi nation, which was looking to be on path, has now been stopped in its tracks, it seems, with the Saudis committing their support to the Palestinians and their demand that a ceasefire be put in place and the bombing of Gaza stop. The Iranian foreign minister has called for a total oil and gas embargo by the Islamic countries against nations that support Israel. Now, oil reserves coming out of the Middle East, if Saudi Arabia agrees to slow things down or to embargo anyone, if the Iranians wish to enforce blockade control over the Persian Gulf, which is something that they can do, you could really see things escalating in this area. The Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, interestingly, had a meeting with U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. Reportedly, he made Blinken wait all night for the meeting. It was apparently supposed to be scheduled in the evening, and it didn't happen until the morning, and he was made to wait for a few hours before he was told it was being postponed. Jordan and in a meeting with Mahmoud Abbas and Joe Biden, they have cancelled that meeting after the hospital attack. So the Americans not getting to meet, not getting the reception they may have expected or have felt they were entitled to get in these Arab nations at the moment. Also, interestingly, in a video address by Russian President Putin, he has announced that there are now going to be full-time patrols conducted by MiG-31s over the southern Black Sea area, and that these MiG-31s will be armed with Kinjal missiles. The range of these Kinjal missiles is over 1,000 kilometers, some reports up to 1,500 or more kilometers. And they have a speed somewhere around Mach 9, perhaps even higher than Mach 9. So these two MiG-31s, each of them equipped with a Kinjal, they will constantly be in the air around this southern Black Sea area, and it puts the two American aircraft carriers that have moved off the shore of Israel and off the sort of shore of Lebanon, moved into the Eastern Mediterranean there, they will now be within strike range of those MiG-31s. Russia has other missile capabilities in that area. It has some Russian missiles in Syria, which can reach into Israel. Lebanon also, they have some missile capability, and it seems as though at the present time the American fleets, naval fleets and aircraft carriers are sitting just outside the range of that Lebanese missile capability. So, yeah, again, those aircraft carriers have been sent there as a show of power, and now President Putin has put these MiGs in the air with Kinjals, effectively indicating that while you may have your aircraft carriers there, they're within our range, and they would be very difficult for the Americans to protect against a Kinjal attack on one of those aircraft carriers. So, but moving out of the Israel area, moving into the Ukraine, just some interesting bits of information. There's been a report in the New York Times that a recent US Department of Defense assessment has determined that up to 77% of young Americans would be ineligible for enlistment into the Army, Navy, or Air Force due to factors such as being overweight or being engaging in drug use or possessing physical or mental impairments. So it seems as though in general, the general health of the United States youth is not what it used to be the last time the Americans had to draft and form a large army. So when that would have happened back in the late 60s, I'm guessing for Vietnam, the sort of global obesity pandemic really would not have reached into America yet, so they probably had a much fitter available fighting force than they do now. Um, Also, just in terms of people for military service in Ukraine, reporting now that since 2021, the percentage of women in the Ukrainian armed forces has increased by 40%. Um, I've spoken before about some reports where there are moves within Ukraine to mobilise women to fight. There have been reports of large orders being put out for protective body armour and uniforms, detailed and designed for women to wear. So Ukraine looking to mobilise. Apparently in Ukraine they have started blocking bank cards for people who fail to appear at military recruitment centres after they've been requested to do so. So the Ukrainians, Strana news outlet has reported this. So again, lots of challenges with getting people for war, for America and for Ukraine. And as I mentioned, while Israel has large numbers of forces, 300,000 in the reserve forces, how combat ready they may be when it gets into the tooth and nail fighting with Hamas fighters, as I say, is yet to be seen. On the topic of US support, though, the ATACMS missiles. So we do have reports in the last week that ATACMS are in use in Ukraine. While for months now the US has talked about providing them, but indicating they were not yet ready to provide them. As we've mentioned and as expected, they were already in the country. And usually, what happens with the new weapon releases is that they are in use, and then we find out that they have been delivered sometime before. So America has apparently transferred 20 ATACMS Block 1, and there's another 100 to 140 in Poland ready for delivery. These ATACMS have a warhead filled with M74 cluster cartridges, so they are good for soft skin targets, and they can cover a large area. Now, the ATACMS have reportedly been used in an attack on the Berdyansk Air Base, which is the closest range air base in Crimea to the Ukrainian front line. And it is an air base which has a large number of ground attack helicopters operating out of there. So reportedly, perhaps 6 attacker missiles were fired. There is some Russian reporting that some of them were shot down, perhaps 3 of them were shot down. Others appear to have made it to the airbase, and reporting appears to indicate that somewhere between 5 and 9 Russian helicopters may have been damaged or destroyed in this attack on the base. So on one hand, this is a successful use of the ATACMS for the Ukrainians, in that they've struck the airbase and they've done damage to a number of helicopters. And these helicopters, if they are all helicopters, there is reporting that not all 9 of the items damaged were helicopters. A couple may have been Ka-52 attack helicopters, which would be the premium target here. Some may have been different helicopters, and some may actually have been fuel trucks that were there on the airfield. So successful in some extent. However, if the Russian reporting is correct that 3 of the ATACMS were shot down, then this itself is a concern, a real concern, because it indicates that already Russian air defense is capable of addressing the ATACMS threat. Now, the ATACMS are effective. They travel at Mach 3.5, so they're faster than the Storm Shadows and the Scalps, which travel at around Mach 1. They currently only have a range of about 165 kilometres, which people consider this as being an indication that America is concerned and paying heed to Russia's red line, that if they gave the longer range, the 300 kilometre ATACMS, that the Ukrainians might start to use these on targets on Russian soil. And this would be seen as stepping over a red line, and because the Americans had provided the ATACMS, that the Americans would then become targets, direct targets for the Russians in this conflict. So yeah, they. But in terms of air defense, Russian air defense against the ATACMS traveling at Mach 3.5, faster than the Storm Shadows, but not as fast as the Tocha 1. Now, the Tocha 1, which Ukrainians have been fired, the Russians have been intercepting these. So, in some respects, this has been a useful engagement, a useful experiment for the Ukrainian air defense to see some ATACMS in action for the first time. And no doubt they will have captured data and be learning from this. And so, a success in some respects that it may have destroyed 2 attack helicopters, the other ones perhaps not helicopters or perhaps repairable. On the other hand, is now given some information to the Russians, and with the small number of them, 20 of them reportedly already in country, and 100 to 140 possibly in Poland. Yeah, difficult to say how successful they may be, particularly if the Russians do get on top of them with air defense very quickly. One other thing which is a benefit of the ATACMS, though, is that unlike the Storm Shadow and the Scalp missiles, which are launched from Su-24 aircraft, the ATACMS are launched from MLRS, multiple launch rocket system launchers. So these things can be driven around on the back of an MLRS vehicle. So you're mobile, you can drive up to an intersection, fire them, and drive away very quickly to set up and get out of the area, which is again different to having to launch Su-24s. All of the launch points for Su-24s the Russians are aware of and monitor via one means or another. And as soon as those Su-24s get into the air, interceptor aircraft, Russian aircraft, are then launched to go and prepare and try to intercept them before they get to a launch point. In terms, just with NATO. So, in some interesting, a couple of times, we've mentioned cracks appearing here with like Slovakia and Poland and Hungary saying, they're not going to accept Ukrainian grain, things like that. Well, this week there has been a meeting between Viktor Orban, Hungary's Prime Minister, with Russian President Vladimir Putin. And in their meeting, they were very friendly and talked about wanting to continue good relations with each other and work together as best they could. This is not something that NATO wants to see, with Hungary talking to President Putin like this. So challenges, rifts perhaps starting to appear. Poland already having announced they're no longer going to be providing direct military aid to Ukraine. Poland now, however, having gone through an election where the incumbent party actually obtained the bulk of the vote, getting nearly 40% of the vote, but looks like they will not be forming part of the coalition. So, in fact, 3 of the minor parties are looking to form a coalition in Poland there. So changing times within NATO nations, and definitely some conflicts perhaps occurring there. Again, Turkey, a good example. Turkey always on sort of on the fence or a knife edge between its relations with Russia and its NATO relations. Now, Turkey voicing strong support for the Palestinians in Gaza. Again, this perhaps clashing with the position of clearly of the US and of some other NATO nations. US, yes, I mentioned before, US spending is continuing. $74 billion. Biden's looking for an announcement just yesterday. $60 billion for Ukraine and $14 billion for Israel. The US budget deficit in this fiscal year 2023 has increased by $320 billion, or 0.3 trillion, to $1.7 trillion, the White House has announced. Clearly a large amount of that has been spent on the Ukrainian conflict, and now that will be pivoting to be spent on the Israel conflict. reports that Israel is receiving already from the United States a shipment of 155mm shells. Now, this is bad news for Ukraine. The 155mm shells are the ones which the West is struggling to produce to keep up with Ukraine's needs. The West has started to provide Ukraine with cluster munition versions of 155mm shells and not the high explosive version which they're after. So now, reportedly, these 155mm shells that are going to Israel had previously been earmarked and set aside for Ukraine, but they are now not going that way. So we can see here the United States priorities. It's Israel first and then Ukraine. Ukraine, a proxy war with Russia to try to weaken Russia. That's backfired, but that's what that is. Israel is America's foothold of control within the Middle Eastern area. It's of vital importance to the Americans that Israel remain powerful and capable of defending itself in this area. So this is why this needs to be played very well, because if Iran does get into this fight and decide to join it, then we may well see, as we say, the American aircraft carriers launching attacks into Syria and Israel, Lebanon, Gaza, the West Bank. This would then may lead to the Russians getting involved with their MiG-31s and the Kinjals from the Black Sea, attacking the American fleet. This could really blow up into a major crisis in this area. Hence, again, part of the reason why it seems the Israelis have backed off on an immediate ground offensive, perhaps looking to negotiate in the background with some of the Arab nations just to try to cool things down a little bit, because otherwise Israel realizes that if Hezbollah decide to join the fight, then while they have a large group of forces tied up in Gaza, trying to deal with Hamas there, it's very likely then that the West Bank will erupt, and if Hezbollah push down from the northern border, and there's already fighting going on the northern border, localized skirmishes there with anti-tank missiles being fired in from Lebanon to Israeli locations. If that really kicks off in the north, then that will split the Israeli focus, and again, with an relatively untested and some might consider soft reserve army fighting against Hezbollah and Hamas, who have lived and operated under far more deprived conditions, and you would think would be more seasoned, just in general. That might be a very tough fight for the Israelis to come out on top of. Okay, getting back to Ukraine again, just going to talk through the Ministry of Defence update. Now, this is the weekly update, so this runs from the 14th to the 20th of October. This is from the Russian Ministry of Defence. These reports come out on a daily basis and on once a week, a weekly basis now. They provide us with at least a consistent form of reporting of what's occurring in the areas. I will add in a couple of areas here some reports from other sources. So I'll cover off the Ministry of Defence reporting because that gives us its common breakdown on what has happened in terms of reported Ukrainian manpower and equipment losses in the main area of fighting. And then I'll add in a little bit from some of these other areas just to give a bit of a different view, or perhaps a view of what's happening on the ground there. So starting up in the north, unfortunately today I don't have my normal setup. I'm not in the studio, so I can't show the map at the same time. But from working from memory here in Kupiansk direction, up in the northeastern area of the fighting, this is where the Russian Zapad group of forces are operating. In the last week, they've repelled 61 attacks by the AFU units. The AFU is the Armed Forces of Ukraine. However, Ukrainian Kharkov Telegram channels are reporting a serious shortage of blood in hospitals for wounded fighters. According to local information, doctors in city hospitals are voluntarily and forcibly required to donate blood themselves, and are looking for donors among friends and families and staff of the hospital to be able to provide enough blood to deal with the wounded that are coming in from the Kupiansk direction. Reporting, this is coming from the Ukrainian Telegraph channel, reportedly in the recent days, the 14th, 32nd and 115th Mechanized Brigades of the AFU have suffered huge losses in the direction of Kupiansk. Going to the Russian Ministry of Defense reporting, they talk about aviation and artillery attacks on the AFU's 14th, 25th, 43rd, 44th and 115th Mechanized and 68th Jaeger and 95th Air Assault Brigades close to Sinkovka, Ivanovka, and Timkovka and Makievka. Sinkovka is right up at the top near Kupiansk. Up in that area there has been slow positional fighting going on there for some time, and it seems as though the Russians are starting to gain positions here and are slowly consolidating them. They're not just rushing forward. It seems they advance, they capture a Ukrainian position. Once they are able to hold it, they then take time to repair that trench or that position which may have been damaged in fighting, look to resupply it with munitions and food and water and troops to be able to then have a solid place to then further their next tactical small advancement forward. So that seems to be the tactic which the Russians are using at this stage, not blitzkrieging, just running through, trying to get to the Oskil River. It looks like they will slowly work their way conclusively to the Oskil River in this area, but will do it without being pushed backwards because they are solidifying, sort of cementing their positions as they achieve them, is what seems to be happening. In the Kupiansk region, the enemy losses were reported at more than 995 servicemen. Now, in the Kupiansk region, this is a high number for a week of fighting, so there certainly has been an increase in fighting in this area. Now, we will get to the Donetsk area and Avdiivka. This has become the new Bakhmut to some extent. This heavily fortified and dug in the township of Avdiivka is a priority for Ukraine to hold on to. It is being encircled in a cauldron, as the Russians refer to it, and the Russian pressure in Kupiansk is drawing resources north and away from Avdiivka, which is causing the Ukrainians real problems because they are struggling to reinforce in the north, in Kupiansk, in Avdiivka and Donetsk, then down in Zaporozhye region, in Robotne, and also in Kherson now. So Kherson becoming the new big front for the Ukrainian push, which we'll get to in a moment, but struggling to be able to solidify that push in Kherson because of the need to reinforce in areas like Krasny Liman, Kupiansk and the Donetsk region. So in Kupiansk, a large number, nearly 1,000 servicemen reportedly killed and wounded, 10 tanks, 27 armoured fighting vehicles, 20 motor vehicles, as well as 18 field artillery guns in the last week. In the Krasny Liman direction, this is where the centre group of forces operate with aviation, artillery and heavy flamethrower systems. They have reportedly repelled 18 attacks of assault groups of the AFU's 63rd, 67th Mechanised Brigades and the 12th Special Forces Brigade. Even in Krasny Liman, reportedly the casualties in this week were more than 940 Ukrainian personnel. Now, as I said before, the Ministry of Defense provides Ukrainian losses reportedly based upon interceptions of Ukrainian communications. The Ministry of Defense doesn't estimate this based upon video footage or reports of attacks from their soldiers. It reportedly, if this is correct, and if we believe this reporting comes from intercepted Ukrainian comms. So in Krasny Liman, which is coming down from, that's coming down about 70 to 80 kilometers down from Kupiansk, 940 Ukrainian personnel killed or wounded, 21 armoured fighting vehicles destroyed, 14 motor vehicles and 5 guns destroyed. Now, in the Donetsk direction, this is where the Yug group of forces are operating. They have been reportedly inflicting damage on the 28th, 56th, 67th and 93rd Mechanized Brigades near Kurdyumovka, Andriivka, Kleshchiivka and Mariinka. Now, Andriivka and Kleshchiivka, those two small settlements at the south of Bakhmut, or Artyomovsk as the Russians call Bakhmut, important, the fighting there, because the railway line runs up through them into the south of Bakhmut. So the Ukrainians would like to be able to get through those settlements, get to the railway line, and then use the railway line both as some level of defence, because it's a raised railway line, and some level of height, some advantage of having some height. Also, there are some areas underneath that railway line where there are concrete underground bunkers. I'm not certain as to why, the purpose of why they were built, if they are water culverts or storage for the rail lines, perhaps. But regardless, they have been used by the Russians as a safe place to retreat to. So the Ukrainians looking in this area north of Donetsk, wanting to get Andriivka and Kleshchiivka, and fighting has been very heavy in those areas, to be able to gain an access way up into Bakhmut, to be able to attack Bakhmut from the south. Now, perhaps the most heavy fighting going on in this area, though, is just in the Avdiivka, so in the Avdiivka township, which is just to the west of the northwest of Donetsk city itself. This is the heavily reinforced township where the Ukrainians have, over the last 8 or 9 years, reinforced this area and used it as a location to shell. One of the locations used to shell Donetsk city itself. The Russian forces have made ground in the last 2 weeks around Avdiivka, attacking from the south, attacking from the southwest and making quite a bit of ground that way, and also attacking from the north and coming down from that way. Those attacks seem to be following the same sort of tactics as in Kupiansk. They are moving slowly, they're capturing locations, and then they are solidifying those locations, resupplying them, repairing them when repair is necessary, filling them with stocks and munitions so that they can then move forcefully from those positions. Ukrainian reports from within Avdiivka make it sound like it is just hell. Reportedly, the Russian first phase of the Russian artillery strikes and rocket strikes on Avdiivka were massive and terrifying if you were there in the township. Fighting now going on for the slag heap, the large dump hill over the northern area of Avdiivka, just outside the coke plant. The coke plant, a coke refining plant, not a coke soft drink plant, is heavily reinforced. Now, already a large concrete industrial plant, heavy equipment sort of plant. It's now the perhaps will end up being the last holdout of the Ukrainian forces as the Russians begin to lay siege, I guess, is what's happening to Avdiivka. They have not yet cut off entirely the access roads to Avdiivka, but they do have fire control over those roads. So the resupply and evacuation of Ukrainian forces out of Avdiivka is becoming harder and harder, and there are reports of the Russians using heavy bunker-busting bombs in these areas. So in the Donetsk area, in summary, so from the Bakhmut region down to Donetsk itself, the Ministry of Defense reports that the enemy losses in this week were over 2,065 servicemen. So, very, very heavy fighting here. What's that? We're averaging nearly 300 men killed or wounded, or Ukrainian men killed or wounded a day across that short line of the front. 4 tanks, interesting, only 4 tanks in that. 14 armoured fighting vehicles, 27 motor vehicles, and 28 field artillery guns. Also, reportedly, aviation and missile troops have destroyed 5 ammunition depots in the Donetsk region. In the South Donetsk region, this is in the areas near Ugleda and Urozhaina and Staromayorsk. In this direction, the Russian units are reported as having captured favourable positions and repelled 2 attacks by assault groups of the Ukrainian 58th Motorised Infantry and the 72nd Mechanised, close to Urozhaina and Staromayorsk. The Ukrainian losses in this area are reported as being 1,010 servicemen, 9 armoured fighting vehicles, 19 motor vehicles, 8 field artillery guns, and 1 MLRS system. This fighting here in South Donetsk is the area along the Voremka ledge, and fighting has really sort of stalled here for the Ukrainians at the Urozhaina level. So moving to the west, Zaporozhye direction. So here, this is around the areas of Rabotny and Verbova. Here, the Ministry of Defense reports that 10 attacks of the armed forces of Ukraine, attacks near Verbova and Rabotny, have been repelled. The enemy, in this case, the Ukrainian, in this reporting, they refer to the Ukrainians as the enemy. The Ukrainian losses were more than 475 servicemen, 11 tanks, 22 armoured fighting vehicles, 18 motor vehicles, and 14 field artillery guns. Now, the Kherson direction. So the Kherson area is where there has been an amassing of Ukrainian forces over the last couple of months. In this week, we have seen some attempts to break across the islands and the Dnieper River there to get to the left bank or the eastern side of the river where the Russian positions are. Now, there have been continued small landing attempts, however, there have been no significant success. Rybar reporting did indicate during the week that there may have been some Ukrainian success in capturing a town. It appears, though, that may have been confused and has been walked back now. It may have been that perhaps some Ukrainian scouts had got out that far, but the Ukrainians had not captured that town. It seems now that most of the Ukrainian forces have been pushed back over the river or back into the islands of the Dnieper. There is ample footage over the last couple of days of Ukrainian boats, amphibious equipment being destroyed by either artillery shells or by FPV drones. President Zelensky actually visited this area not long ago and has apparently assumed some level of control over the direction of the fighting here. And it is understood that he sees this as being the last opportunity to show some sort of a victory, particularly now as Israel is competing for US and Western aid. Zelensky tried to go to Israel to get himself into the camera frame, and it was rebuffed and rejected by the Israelis, saying that now is not the time for him to visit. So he's seeing that if something can happen in Kherson, a large amphibious landing which is successful, can clear past the Antonovsky Bridge area and swoop around and get some people to reach down into Crimea, that would be a distraction, and that would give some success and something to cheer about, and turn American attention back to Ukraine, and then turn aid back to Ukraine. However, they are having, I think, a challenge even in Kherson, as I said, with trying to hold on to Avdiivka and resupply there, with trying to stop the Russian grinding movements westwards in the Kupiansk area, with perhaps the need to move reserves from even the Kherson region to some of these other areas, is reducing their ability to make an attack, a successful attack across the Dnieper in this area. The Russian Russian Ministry of Defense says that in the Kherson region in the last week, up to 345 servicemen have been killed or wounded. 11 field artillery guns, 48 boats, and 38 motor vehicles have been destroyed. This is one area where we see boats really being included, so 48 boats. These are usually small, fast craft for getting across the river quickly. In summary, over the last week, the Ministry of Defence reports that their fighter jets and air defence combined have eliminated 12 aircraft, 10 MiG-29, 2 Su-25 fighter jets, and 2 Mi-8 helicopters over the past week. Now, if these numbers are correct, that is a large number of aircraft to be losing in a week. To lose 12 in a week like that, and to have that happening week on week and be perhaps increasing at this time. So I would expect that we may see these numbers of 12 or 15 in a week continue as Ukrainian ability in air defence capability is reduced. Although interestingly, in the weekly summary there, what we didn't see there, which may just have been because it wasn't included in the weekly summarise, there wasn't a mention there of the ANTPQ, like the anti-battery radars, which you've seen so many of them being reported destroyed. If they haven't been destroyed this week, and that's why they've not been included in here, because they haven't been destroyed anywhere, then I guess that means one of two things. Either that's been a positive week for the Ukrainians in that they've been able to husband them well, or it may be a sign that they are running out of them. It may be a bad sign and that they are likely to suffer more in the counter-battery fights than if they don't have those sort of radars available to them. We'll see. In the Odessa and Kryvyi Rog regions, so and around Mykolaiv, just the northeast of Odessa, there are reports today of targeted Russian missile launches at Ukrainian S-200 air defence sites and them being destroyed. The attacks are happening in these areas because of these air defences that have been detected, and also reportedly because of the stationing and marshalling of Ukrainian armed forces in the reservists in these areas are likely to be being prepared to be sent into the Kherson region. So it seems as though targeting of those groups of reservists and the air defence in the area around and just north of Odessa has been happening. This I will see and have seen and will continue to see the ongoing targeting of air defence around Odessa, as I expect that in the coming months we will ultimately see the Russians looking to push past and through Kherson, over the Dnieper River, and then ultimately down to Odessa, which, if I can find my notes back here somewhere, the Secretary of National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Oleksiy Danilov, has called on Georgia and Moldova to open a second front against Russia. Now, Moldova, which is just over on the very sort of southwest of Ukraine, and has Transnistria on its eastern border with Ukraine. That Transnistria thin sliver there is a sort of a Russian separatist enclave. Joins onto Odessa there, so the thoughts are that Russia might like to push all the way across to there and to be able to then join up Odessa, which would become Russia, with Transnistria. So hence this is Oleksiy Danilov calling on Moldova to start something with Transnistria to draw Russian forces away and to start a larger conflict there. Similar with Georgia down to the west of Russia. They could start something in that area, some conflict in that area, which again would draw Russian attention, and if that were to occur, that would help the Ukrainian position by drawing Russian forces and attention to other areas. Look, I think that's... this last thing, over the Black Sea. So the Russians there reportedly have detected air targets, reconnaissance planes in these areas. A couple of Russian Su-27 fighters were scrambled and sent up because of an RAF Typhoon multi-role fighters accompanying some RC-13005 electronic reconnaissance and electronic warfare aircraft. So there have been multiple and increasing reports of US reconnaissance drones in the areas of the Black Sea. Seems now that some of the UK craft are involved in that as well. And Russia looking to keep them away, as they have often preceded attacks of one form or another onto Crimea or the Kerch Bridge. So the Russians obviously looking to keep the reconnaissance out of that area so as to limit their ability to guide Ukraine in attacks on the Crimea area. Okay, that's it for today. In the next day or so, I should be back to sort of normal reporting, I would expect. I hope your weekend is going well, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.